Hello, my name is Kirsten Tibballs. I'm a global ambassador for Callebaut chocolate. I'm going to be demonstrating for you this chocolate mousse cake, and I've incorporated 6 of the Callebaut chocolates. It's not only beautiful to look at, but it's delicious to eat. We have chocolate cake coated in a chocolate crunch layer, chocolate mousse finished with a shiny chocolate glaze, and garnished with a beautiful Callebaut chocolate. This is a cake layer for our mousse cake, and the mousse cake that I'm making, I'm putting in a silicone mold, but you can put it in any mold shape that you like. I just thought I'd tell you that up front. In this particular cake, I'm using the 70-30-38 Callebaut chocolate.
First step, we're going to combine the 70% dark chocolate with some unsalted butter. You can either melt that on a bain-marie or in the microwave.
At this stage, you need to preheat your oven at 170 degrees Celsius for a fan-forced oven. To start the cake mixture, I've got some almond paste here, but it's also referred to as marzipan. Always check the percentage on the packet and make sure it matches the percentage of mine. So if it says 65% or 50%, that's indicative of the amount of nuts, and the remainder is usually sugar. So add that into the mixer with a paddle attachment. I'm going to add some sugar in. I'm going to start that mixing on a low speed. Gradually increase the speed as the sugar starts to incorporate. I have egg yolks and eggs, which I'm going to combine together, and I'm going to break them up a little bit so I can control how much I add. Now this is the important part. When you're adding your mixed eggs and egg yolks, you can't add them too quickly, particularly at the start, or else you're going to get lumps of the marzipan. So we're going to add a little bit at a time and let it fully incorporate before adding any more. We'll let the mixer do its thing. Add some more egg. Scrape down the bowl as needed. Once that's all combined, I'm going to change the paddle to a whisk attachment. We're now going to mix it until it becomes quite light and creamy. So you'll notice a difference when it lightens in colour. So when the mixture like this lightens in colour, it means it's incorporating more and more air, the lighter it becomes. This is exactly what we're looking for. Take this off the mixer, transfer it to another bowl, clean the bowl thoroughly, and then we're going to start whipping our egg white. Before I go any further, I'm going to prepare the baking tray. Just spray it lightly with vegetable oil. Place a sheet of baking paper in, and I've just cut the corners there so I can fold them into each other, eliminate any air bubbles from the base, and we're ready to start whisking our egg white. Egg whites are always better and incorporate more air if you whisk them when they're at room temperature rather than straight from the fridge. Make sure your egg whites are very clean, so no yolks at all in there. We're going to add a little bit of cream of tartar. Now this is a byproduct of making wine. It's acidic. What it does is it helps to bind the protein and water in the egg white and gives us a much creamier meringue that's less likely to separate. So we add that in before we start whisking. This is our second group of sugar. I'm going to add that in at the start and whisk it all together till we come to a medium peak. Another tip is when you're baking with whipped egg whites in the recipe, it's always important to slowly increase the speed. If you go full blast at the start, you'll incorporate uneven air pockets, so some large and some small. Now those air pockets expand when we bake the cake, so it's important that we get really even and consistent incorporation of air, and we do that by slowly increasing the speed. This is a consistency that we're looking for. So a good meringue will be very tight in structure, so it should reflect light. I'm going to incorporate the meringue into the almond base, just a small amount to start with. Just folding it so we retain as much air as possible. Add in another portion. we add in the remaining meringue. We've got this beautiful light and creamy mixture. I'm now going to sieve in the dry ingredients. Got some plain flour or all-purpose flour, some Callebaut Dutch processed cocoa powder. Now the advantage of using the Dutch processed cocoa powder is the Callebaut product has 22 to 24% cocoa butter, so it's adding a lot of moisture to your cake. If you were to use a cocoa powder with a lower fat content, it can actually dry out your cake. So not only is it going to give you a rich, beautiful chocolate flavour, but it's adding a lot of moisture as well. Lastly, we have baking powder. Sieve that in. And once again, we gently fold that through. This is a great cake if you want to bake it in a cake tin as well. Really moist but light, really delicious. You could layer that with some cream if you wanted to. And this is going to be the base, and we're also going to use it in the center of our mousse cake. This is the butter and the chocolate. It's a 70, 30, 38. Quite a mouthful, I know, but I'll explain the numbers for you. So 70% is 70% of the cocoa bean is present in this chocolate. 30% is indicative of the amount of sugar in the chocolate, and 38% tells us there's 38% cocoa butter. Such a beautiful chocolate to use and perfect for baking. Now, rather than pouring this mixture into the bowl, by the way, make sure it's still warm and it hasn't set up too much. I'm going to take a little bit of the sponge mixture and put it in and mix that together with the butter and chocolate before adding it in. So that way it's a similar consistency. Sometimes if we add liquids into a cake batter like this, it just runs to the bottom, and then we need to overwork the mix and lose quite a bit of air to incorporate it. Okay, mixing that together. Okay, now we're pouring it in. You can see that consistency is much more similar to that of our cake batter now. Don't worry if it's hot. And then just once again, gently fold that through. I'm rotating the bowl as I'm folding, so I'm ensuring that I'm scraping all the sides down. Now this is my go-to chocolate cake recipe for so many applications, so trust me, it's well worth making it. We're going to spread this out evenly using a palette knife. This is what a palette knife is, and an angled one is much easier to spread it out. Angle the palette knife slightly. We want this to be as even as possible. Oh, it's so good. You can see that I don't like wastage. Use every little bit. Now I'm going to bake that in the fan-forced oven that we've already set at 170 degrees Celsius. Now that's going to bake for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Now I've given you a wide time range there because every oven is different. How you're going to know it's ready is when you gently press on the surface, it will bounce back. The cake is baked and I've cooled it completely at room temperature. You may find it easier to apply the crunch layer if this cake is frozen. Before you start your crunch layer, we're just going to remove any loose skin. If you don't remove the skin, when you put the crunch layer on and you go to cut the cake, those two layers can separate. So by removing this skin, we're ensuring that those two layers will adhere together really well. I'm going to place a tray on top, flip it over. Then we flip it back the right side up. Before you start the crunch layer, prepare the sponge. We're going to cut 2 different size pieces for our cake. But as I said earlier, this cake can be made in any size. So if you don't have a silicone mold, you can use a cake ring. Line the cake ring with either oil spray and icing sugar so it doesn't stick, or you can put acetate on the side. What I do use as a rule when I'm doing a sponge or a cake insert inside a mousse cake is I leave 1 centimetre on either side of the cake between the mould and the cake itself, so the mousse can go right down to the edge to avoid air bubbles. So I'm just going to trim off the edge to the start. Gives you a little bit of a taste test before you put it into the cake. There will be a little bit of this cake left over, which you can freeze and use at a later date. So we're going to go 20 centimetres in length. Our first one is 4.5 centimetres across, the next one is 5 centimetres. Now the reason I've got two slightly different sizes is because the mold is wider at the bottom, and we're going to use this cake in the center, and the wider piece goes on the base. We only need 2 pieces for this particular cake that I'm making, but as I said, if you're making a larger cake, you might use more of our cake preparation. Otherwise, we can freeze this and keep it in the freezer for up to 8 weeks if it's well covered. This is a crunch layer to go on top of our cake. It's important when you're assembling and making a mousse cake or even designing one that you have a multitude of textures. Now this particular layer is going to give us more texture than any other element in the cake. And I'm using the Callebaut 823 milk couverture as the base for this layer. Now we don't have to be absolutely perfect with our heating and cooling of this chocolate. We are going to go through the steps you would to temper the chocolate, but we do have a little bit of flexibility because we're adding 3 ingredients to the chocolate that are at an ambient temperature, so it can be a little bit warm. I'm going to put this in the microwave and I'm going to heat it in 30-second increments on high until I've got half liquid, half solid chocolate, then simply bring it out and stir it. If you've got some stubborn buttons then that haven't melted, you can simply heat it up a little bit with a hairdryer or a heat gun, or put it back in the microwave for 10 seconds. But if you're very close but not quite there, my preference is to use a hairdryer or a heat gun because it's much easier to control. So this is what we're looking for with the chocolate. I've just combined it. All the colettes have melted. Give it a good mix and now we can start incorporating the other ingredients. Now I'm adding peanut butter, but if you do have access to the Callebaut hazelnut praline paste, that would certainly be my preference, but I'm using this for those of you who may not be able to access it. The reason we're adding peanut butter is because the nut oil in the peanuts gives us a softer set, so when we cut the cake, this crunch layer isn't going to crack. And mix that together with the chocolate. I'm using crunchy peanut butter to add another element of texture. I have rice bubbles here, which have a beautiful crunchy texture. We can only add the rice bubbles in because the ingredients that we've added so far don't contain very much water, which enables the rice bubbles to stay crunchy. I've got candied orange here. I have written on the recipe. You can also use diced glacé cherries or any sort of candied or glacé fruit. Don't use mixed peel because that's just had the moisture taken out of it and it can be quite bitter. So use candied orange, candied lemon, glacé cherries, or any sort of glacé fruit you can get, and just finely dice it. Mix that together until all the fruit and rice bubbles are coated. Now this is a stage, if it's a little bit firm, you can apply a little bit of heat with your hairdryer or heat gun and just mix it through. When you're heating with your hairdryer or heat gun, you must stir the chocolate because they're generally quite hot and you can tend to overheat it. So make sure you're stirring as you're heating. Now when applying the crunch layer, don't make it too thick because then it's not all going to fit into your mold. So you're probably looking at about 5 to 6 millimeters in height. So you need to have this all ready before you start your mousse preparation. Make sure you square it up so it doesn't go over the edge of the cake. We place this in the freezer while we prepare our mousse. First step for the mousse is to semi-whip the cream. It means we're going to add some body and volume and air to the cream, but it should still have enough movement in there that we can fold it through the other ingredients. Make sure your cream is straight from the fridge. If it's warm at all, it'll tend to split the butter and water present in the cream. Now I find any cream between 35 to 40% fat is great for whipping and holding air, which is going to give us a much lighter mousse cake. This is what a semi-whipped consistency looks like. So we've incorporated some air, but you can see the cream will still collapse. At this stage, we store this in the fridge till we're ready to incorporate it into our mousse. For this chocolate mousse, I'm using the Callebaut 811. It's a great all-rounder chocolate. It can be used for moulding, garnishes, and an ingredient in mousses and baked goods. So let me tell you a little bit about mousses. This one is very, very simple but beautiful to eat. Now you can replace the 811 dark chocolate with an 823 Callebaut milk chocolate, or you could use a gold chocolate, but you will need to add a little bit of gelatin if you interchange the dark chocolate with one of those lighter chocolates. I would add 1 to 2 sheets of gelatin to the recipe. This is a simple recipe because it's based on a sugar syrup. Slightly aerated but beautiful to eat. First thing you need to do is melt the chocolate till it's half liquid, half solid chocolate. So you can see that I've partially melted the chocolate here, just enough to give it a head start when we pour the syrup over the chocolate. In the saucepan we place water. Always put the water in first so the sugar doesn't sit on the bottom of the saucepan. We follow that with sugar and some glucose which I've heated to make it easier to get out of the bowl. What we're going to do here is really dissolve the sugar. You don't want to boil it for too long because you'll then evaporate too much water and the mousse will be quite thick. It's important that this chocolate doesn't become too cold, so keep it heated. If it needs a little bit more heat before you start your syrup, just warm it up again. Now I've heated that in the microwave, but you can use a double boiler or a bain-marie. All the sugar is dissolved, so I'm going to pour the boiling syrup over the chocolate. Whisk it together. Now we immediately fold it through the semi-whipped cream. So this is where you grab it out of the fridge. Have your mold ready and your cake and your crunch layer ready to go as well. Now we take the semi-whipped cream, just to add a little bit of the start, fold it through. Now you don't want this base mix to be too hot, but it still needs to be warm. We're looking at about 36 to 38 degrees Celsius. If it's too warm, you're going to lose all the air that we've incorporated into the cream. If it's too cold, it's going to set before you get it into your mold. Now we're going to scrape in the remainder of the cream. And we gently fold it through. Such an easy mousse that tastes really beautiful. Light and creamy in texture with that decadent chocolate flavour. So this is a sort of mousse cake that you would serve straight from the fridge. If you're wanting a mousse cake that sits out for a little bit longer, you can add gelatin even to this dark chocolate mousse. I would add 1 to 2 sheets as well, if you want it to sit out for half an hour to an hour before serving. Make sure before you start you have everything set up ready to go. Turn the top of the piping bag down. Now if you don't have one, you can spoon it in. Put your hand underneath the bag and then scoop up the mousse and use this hand to wipe it off the spatula. Twist the end of the bag to create tension. Cut the end of the bag off. Now pipe a generous portion of mousse in the base. I can't stress this enough, any mold is okay. You don't have to use the same shape that I am. Look at that mousse, beautiful. Now using either a small spoon or you can use a palette knife or just a butter knife, we're just going to wipe the mixture up the side of the mold. Now this is going to help to avoid air bubbles on the mousse when you unmold it. When you're glazing, any air bubbles are going to be highlighted with the glaze, so we want to avoid that happening. Make sure all the areas are covered. Now we're ready to put in the slightly thinner strip of cake. Cake side up, crunch side down, and just gently press it in. Don't press it in so much that it goes through to the top of the mold, and try to keep it as straight as possible so when we cut it we get a really beautiful cross section. That's more about me than you. I really like it to be symmetrical. We pipe in additional mousse. So just around the edge. Zigzag on top, just a really thin layer. Wipe it up the sides once again, just to ensure you're not going to have any gaps. Then we put our last layer in. Now just gently press it down. The mousse will come up to meet you. Then just wipe off the excess. Just press it down gently to make sure it's going to be flush with the top of the mold. If it's not flush with the top of the mold, when you glaze it, you're going to have a bit of cake that you'll see underneath. Now, if you're using a cake ring instead of a silicone mold, you might assemble the cake the right way up. Put the chocolate cake and the crunch layer on the base, do a layer of mousse, do another chocolate cake layer and crunch layer, and then at the top, you'll just level the mousse off so it's nice and flat. Or you can do it with the ring even upside down, but there's lots of options. This needs to go in the freezer now. It must stay in the freezer for a minimum of 6 hours, but my preference would be 24 hours if possible. You can make this and leave it in the mold for up to 6 to 8 weeks as long as it's covered. When you take it out of the freezer, you must unmold it immediately. But to do that, you must have your glaze ready to go. When you do unmold it, you can put it back in the freezer and then reuse the mold. But if you do keep it at room temperature, it will need to be glazed or decorated and then ready to serve. I'm creating a glaze now. Well, now we always want that perfect glossy glaze to finish a mousse cake with, and this one's fantastic. And it has simple ingredients that are quite easy to find. We're going to set the glaze with gelatin. That's the secret to a shiny glaze. If you have a lot of chocolate in the glaze, you'll find that it will go dull. If you have a lot of water in the glaze, it'll be shiny. But when we've got a lot of water in the glaze, we need to set it with gelatin. So that's the first step, is to place the sheets of gelatin in a bowl of cold water. Now the gelatin sheets themselves are very confusing. It comes platinum, gold, silver, bronze, titanium. All the gelatin sheets are the same strength per sheet. So 1 sheet of platinum is the same as 1 sheet of silver, which is why you shouldn't weigh your gelatin. You should always go by the number of sheets. Make sure you don't put a clump of the gelatin sheets in, just one at a time, or else they won't hydrate. So these are completely dry, so we need to reintroduce water into the gelatin, and it should absorb 6 times its weight in water. Now in the saucepan, I'm going to combine some water, cream, which main ingredient is water, some sugar. Now we need that sugar because we're adding a Dutch processed cocoa powder once this comes to a boil, which is really quite bitter. So we need to balance that flavour and bitterness by adding the sugar into the glaze. Now that that's come to a boil, I'm going to turn the heat off and add in the Dutch processed cocoa powder from Callebaut. Now I'm going to bring that to a boil again. Don't let it boil for too long because the cocoa powder can catch on the bottom. Now the Dutch processed cocoa powder has had alkaline added to it, which makes it more water soluble. That's come to a boil again. So it easily incorporates with liquids, where a non-Dutch cocoa powder is a little bit harder to emulsify together with liquids. By adding alkaline to the cocoa powder, it also gives us that beautiful, rich, red-brown colour that's very appetizing, but makes it beautiful to eat. I'm going to transfer that into a jug. Don't worry if it's lumpy at this stage, we are going to emulsify it with a stick blender. Now gelatin will start to melt at 28 degrees Celsius, so we need to add it into the glaze while the glaze is still warm. Gently squeeze off the excess water. I'm going to combine that with a stick blender, and I'm going to glaze the frozen mousse cake when the glaze reaches 31 degrees Celsius. Now this can be made the day before and reheated, that's no problem. If you are going to use it the same day, I recommend you leave it at room temperature to cool down. So you can see I've got air bubbles there. I just run this on a low speed with the blade just below the surface, and that will eliminate and pop those bubbles. So you can see I've eliminated all the bubbles, but this is still hot, so it's too hot to glaze the cake with. So I'm going to take the stick blender out and put plastic wrap so it touches the surface of the glaze to avoid getting a skin. Then you're going to cool it down to probably about 28 degrees Celsius, and then re-emulsify it with a stick blender, exactly the same way that I just have. What that does is it's going to eliminate any additional air bubbles, but the reason we cool it down a little bit lower than our glazing temperature is because when we're working with a stick blender, it creates friction and it'll actually heat up the glaze. So that will bring it up to our glazing temperature of 31 degrees. Make sure your cake is fully frozen before your glaze is ready to go. Now for the garnishing, I'm using 3 Callebaut chocolates to finish the glaze cake, And I'm going to temper all three. I'm going to show you how to temper the gold, and it's the same technique for the other two. This is a Callebaut gold chocolate, which is made from roasted milk powder and a small amount of caramelized sugar, and of course a touch of salt. Beautiful flavor. So it's based on a white chocolate. When you're using this method of tempering, you don't have to focus so much on the temperature. So it's time, temperature, and movement. I don't actually use a thermometer, but it is up to you. I find the technique that I use very, very good. So add the chocolate in the bowl. Now my technique is to place this in the microwave in 30-second increments. Towards the end, it might be 10 to 15 seconds on high heat, and stir it every 30 seconds until you've got half liquid, half solid chocolate. When you heat it in the microwave, don't overheat it and don't try and put it in for a minute at a time. 30 to 15-second increments. Start with 30, then you need to cut them down to 15-second increments. Stir it each time you take it out of the microwave, even if it doesn't look like it needs stirring. Once you've got half liquid, half solid chocolate, bring it out to the bench and then just really vigorously stir it. If there's some buttons that haven't melted, you can use a heat gun or a hairdryer just to gently melt those buttons. Always stir it really, really well. So you can see the chocolate is just starting to soften. Another tip, always make sure you're melting it in a plastic bowl because glass retains too much heat and it can untemper the chocolate after you've finished in the microwave. So back to the microwave for me for another 15 seconds. So here we've got about half liquid, half solid chocolate. So this is where the exercise comes in and you give it a really good stir. At this stage, if it's not quite tempered or a little bit thick, I'll apply some heat with a heat gun or a hairdryer. Needs a little zap with the heat gun. You must stir it at the same time while you use the heat gun to ensure that you don't overheat the chocolate. Do it in small bursts, then give it a stir. If you work with the same Callebaut chocolate all the time, you'll get to know the consistency by looking at it to see that's a little bit cold, it may need a little bit more heat, but I do still rely on a test, which I'm about to do. For me, that chocolate's ready to go, but to be sure, I'm going to do a test. To do a test, you can use a piece of baking paper or a little plastic scraper. Dip it in the chocolate. Tap off the excess. If you're like me, you'll be impatient. So the thinner the chocolate, the faster you'll get the result. Now this gold chocolate is going to take up to 10 minutes, but it may set in 5 depending on your room temperature. The ruby chocolate is going to take up to 10 minutes and so is the white. Where if you're tempering milk chocolate, it'll take up to 7 minutes and dark chocolate up to 5 minutes. Now I know what you're thinking, while we're waiting for this to set, the chocolate in the bowl is also setting. If you're working with larger volumes of chocolate, you can use a melting tank, which will retain the temperature for you. Otherwise, you're going to have to use your hairdryer or your heat gun just to gently reheat it a little bit after your test is done. Don't put your finger on the test, and you'll know if your chocolate is ready because the chocolate will set and it'll have a nice even matte finish. Now if it's streaky but it sets, it means you're nearly there, but you need some vigorous stirring before you use it. Now the test has set, you can see it here. It will have a matte finish, it won't be shiny if it's properly tempered. The shiny part will be in contact with the scraper. Now I'm going to repeat the same process and technique for both the ruby chocolate and the Callebaut W2 white chocolate. These are going to be used for the decorations. Now I won't judge you if you do just choose 2 to use. I have used 6 Callebaut chocolates in this recipe, but trust me, it's worth it. The glaze is cooled down. I'm going to re-emulsify it now before I use it and just bring the temperature up slightly. I'm going to do that once again with a stick blender with the same technique. Now how do you know if your glaze is the right thickness? Because you may have boiled your syrup a little bit longer than me or a little bit less, which means you will have more water. So how you test it is to put a spoon in the freezer, dip it in the glaze, pull it out and have a look at the thickness of the glaze. That is how thick it's going to be on your mousse cake. So if you want it to be a little bit thinner, you can add a little bit of water at this stage and then continue to mix it with a stick blender. I've prepared a tray by lining it with plastic wrap and I've put a cooling rack on top for glazing. With the silicone molds, once the product's frozen, they're quite easy to unmold. Now, if you have overfilled the mold beyond the edge of the mold, now's the time just to trim it quickly with a knife before you glaze it. If your glaze is ready to go, don't let the glaze sit because it'll get a skin, and don't let the mousse sit because that will get condensation on the surface, which will create a layer of moisture between the mousse and the glaze, and then the glaze could slide off. So I'm just going to rub off any condensation that may have built up while I'm chatting to you, and then we're ready to go with the glaze. Okay, so here we go. Have someone spotting on the other side to make sure you get all the corners. Those corners are probably the hardest to get. Now, when you're pouring the glaze on, you see I went back over it. You can do that as long as it's straight away. You can't sit there and think, oh, I think it needs a little bit more. Because it has gelatin in it and the cake is frozen, the glaze sets really quickly. So if you pour another lot of glaze on, it might not adhere to the first glaze you've added. I'm going to pipe the chocolate with a paper piping cone, which you make out of a triangle of baking paper. You all got that right? If you don't know how to make paper piping cones, I do actually have a tutorial on my YouTube. You can also just use a Ziploc bag. I'm going to do one chocolate at a time. So starting with the gold, never fill the piping bag more than halfway. And when we close the bag, we always have the seam in the middle, and we fold the corners away from the seam. I'm going to cut a small amount off the end of the bag so it's not too thick. Then I pipe on top of the glaze. We go on to our next chocolate, which is ruby chocolate with a natural ruby colour. Beautiful to eat and looks fantastic as a garnish. So try to cut the same amount off the bag. Give it a test run in the bowl. Then we go again. Any areas where you think you need another stripe, you can just go back over. Now here's a W2 white chocolate, which is fantastic, suitable as an ingredient for moulding chocolates or as a garnish. A really versatile, good all-rounder. Here we go, on top once again. Just going to go over a couple more times. Just a couple of the gold and a couple of the ruby. Now some of the chocolate is going to go into the glaze underneath, but once you scrape that glaze up, you can reuse it. Next time you reheat it, that chocolate's going to incorporate and you can reuse the glaze again. It can last in the fridge for up to 2 weeks or in the freezer for up to 6 weeks. Don't let it sit there for too long. What I'm going to do is use a knife just to cut the chocolate. Heat the knife if your chocolate is thicker than mine. And we do the other side. Now I won't judge you if you just do one chocolate over the top instead of 3. We just pick it up with a palette knife. Now I'm going to place it down on the plate. And then with a little bit of help from a knife, pull the palette knife out and then just press the knife blade down so it flexes and pull it out. Now for me, mousse cakes don't have to be complicated. You might be looking at me thinking that's really quite complex. It's easy once you break it down, and remember you can make lots of the steps at different stages so you don't have to make it all in the one day. But it's amazing what you can achieve with the Callebaut range of chocolates. In this cake here, I used 6 different Callebaut chocolates, and the result, the flavour and the finish is outstanding. So we've got 70-30-38, got the 811, we've got the milk 823, we've got the white W2, we then have the gold chocolate and the ruby chocolate. All have their own amazing attributes that have contributed to this beautiful mousse cake.